Okay, I want you to picture something for a second. Imagine a world where, if you just have enough cash, you can literally buy an internet ad to find an adoptable child. I mean, you completely bypass the waiting lists, open up your wallet, and basically lease a Google AdWords campaign that directly targets vulnerable, pregnant people who are just searching online for help. It sounds completely dystopian, right? But according to the investigative sources we're diving into today, this is the jarring reality of modern online baby brokering.
To put this into perspective, there's a pitch from an entity calling itself Chosen Parents Adoptions, Inc., and they are out there offering what they call a DIY AdWords campaign. They're telling prospective parents, hey, you can lease this from us, bypass traditional agencies entirely, and just buy your way to the very top of Google search results for phrases like, I want to give my baby up for adoption. As our sources outline, this exposes a highly transactional, incredibly dark underbelly to an industry that, let's be honest, we usually associate with pure altruism.
So, welcome to today's explainer. Today we are zooming way out. We're starting with that single troubling internet ad, but we're going to unpack a vast and deeply fractured system. The source material we are exploring today paints a pretty intense picture. It suggests that America and its people are fundamentally psychologically broken, basically clinging to this feel-good narrative of rescue while allegedly ignoring a massive coercion pipeline that's separating families for profit and political gain.
Here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll start with the business of adoption, then explore the coercion pipeline. From there, we'll look at the dismantling of global protections, dive into the biopolitics of state control, examine that fractured American psyche driving all of this, and finally look at a proposed covenant of care to rebuild the system.
Starting off with Section 1, the business of adoption, digital baby brokering.
When you actually do a forensic breakdown of those claims from chosen parents versus what open source intelligence actually found, it's pretty eye-opening. They claim to be the #1 U.S. adoption service with this big proprietary campaign, yet OSINT investigations reveal some massive red flags. We're talking a standard Gmail address, no verified physical headquarters, and absolutely no Better Business Bureau profile. And most critically, they explicitly state they are not a licensed adoption agency. That loophole is exactly what allows them to charge these ongoing monthly fees while completely avoiding the legal responsibilities of actual child placement.
And this brings us to a foundational contradiction that the author calls the adoption paradox. See, the public narrative insists that adoption is viewed purely as an act of altruism and rescue. It's a beautiful thing, but the investigative reports reveal a system that is heavily transactional and commodified. The author asserts that this system actually relies on the economic distress of birth families to maintain a steady supply of adoptable children, basically using the failures of our social safety net as its fuel.
Moving to Section 2, the coercion pipeline, loopholes and exploitation.
To understand how those local market forces scale up, we have to look at what the text defines as the coercion pipeline. And it's important to note, this isn't just one bad actor or one scammy website. It's a whole network of systems, policies, and actors facilitating the unethical separation of families. It leverages the economic precarity of birth families to manufacture demand. Because of fragmented regulations, like legal exemptions allowing private attorneys to broker adoptions without agency oversight, it creates huge vectors for serious abuse.
Just to show you how extreme that abuse can actually get, think about this number, $814,000. According to the investigation, this is the exact amount of Medicaid fraud committed by Paul Peterson, who was an elected official and adoption attorney in Arizona. He orchestrated a massive human smuggling operation. He was illegally bringing pregnant women from the Marshall Islands to the U.S., housing them in poor conditions, and then using state taxpayer money to subsidize the maternity care for this completely illegal adoption enterprise.
Now, the sources also point to certain legislative efforts that they argue actually worsened this pipeline. Take H.R. 9218, for example. It's a bill allowing prospective adoptive parents to pay for a pregnant person's rent, their utilities, and medical bills. On paper, it sounds helpful, but the author argues that instead of genuinely supporting families, this turns the pregnancy into a really high-pressure transaction. The idea is that once that money changes hands, an implicit expectation is created. We paid for your life, so you owe us your baby. It seriously blurs the line between adoption support and outright coercion.
And these financial incentives, they go all the way up to the federal level. Consider the $75 million in federal adoption incentive payments allocated for fiscal year 2024. The investigative report claims this creates a massive structural conflict of interest, where state agencies are literally financially rewarded for the sheer volume of children placed into adoptive homes, rather than focusing their resources on family preservation.
This dynamic was actually fiercely criticized by former Georgia State Senator Nancy Schaefer. She called the whole system a corrupt, cash-for-kids business, right before she was tragically found dead in 2010.
All right, Section 3, Dismantling Global Protections, the Unseen Fissure. When domestic policy priorities intersect with international human rights, we see global impacts. The report notes a timeline here. After decades of anti-trafficking progress, the Trump administration enacted sweeping cuts to global protections. They terminated over $700 million in International Labor Affairs Bureau grants and slashed the State Department's anti-trafficking TIP office staff by over 70%. According to the text, the result was a global surge in child labor, poverty, and vulnerability. And that created incredibly fertile ground for exploitation by unscrupulous actors in the adoption industry.
The author argues that cutting these safety nets has absolutely devastating consequences. When these programs are defunded, children who are just living in profound poverty or who are victims of trafficking are easily misidentified or intentionally misrepresented as orphans just to feed the demand for international adoption. Without robust anti-trafficking oversight, the system literally cannot verify if a child truly needs a new family or if they simply need systemic support to stay with their own.
And this actually plays out in real-world crisis zones. The text details what's known as the Matt Shea operation. This is where a former Washington state representative allegedly used an unlicensed, Texas-based nonprofit to transfer 62 Ukrainian children straight out of a war zone. Ukraine had actually suspended intercountry adoptions to prevent trafficking, yet this operation completely bypassed those international Hague protocols under the guise of humanitarian aid. It just exposes these severe regulatory gaps that happen when political status is leveraged.
Which brings us to Section 4, Biopolitics and the State. Masking control as care. So what's the ideology actually driving all of this? Well, the author uses a framework called biopolitics, which is a concept originally from the philosopher Michel Foucault. Biopolitics is basically the state's ability to manage its populations through health, reproduction, and life itself. The author asserts that modern conservatism utilizes this apparatus of power to control who exactly gets to be a parent and who belongs to the nation, wrapping all that systemic control up in the seemingly benevolent language of protection and charity. The text contrasts some major state actions with the public ways they're justified. It points to the Trump administration's zero-tolerance border separations and the post-Dobbs state-level abortion bans, noting how these policies are championed using the rhetoric of rescue, pro-life, and family values. The arguers argue this is a classic disciplinary regime, turning trauma into policy while demanding that the public celebrate it as an act of altruism.
Section 5, The Fractured American Psyche. A nation divided. This brings us to the profound psychological toll this all takes. The source states, adoption, for far too many, isn't just about starting fresh. It's about rewriting identities. And this is where we hit that core theme. The author claims America and its people are fundamentally psychologically broken. Why? Because as a society, we romanticize adoption as this perfect, beautiful solution, while actively suppressing and ignoring the deep trauma of adoptees and the marginalized birth families who are separated by poverty or coercion.
This ideological brokenness basically results in institutionalized trauma. The reports highlight something called legal abuse syndrome, which is the severe psychological scarring caused by navigating a really hostile family court system. Furthermore, this trauma is sustained by the state's absolute insistence on sealing original birth certificates, which permanently denies adoptees access to their own histories and identities. And when adoptees actually speak out, using movements like #AdopteeVoices, the author notes they are so often silenced and told to simply be grateful.
Finally, Section 6, A Covenant of Care, Rebuilding the System.
So how exactly do we fix a system that's so deeply entrenched in these contradictions? The author proposes a blueprint to shift the whole paradigm from extraction to care. First, preservation first, providing universal financial and social support so that poverty never, ever forces a family apart. Second, transparency always, legally mandating unrestricted access to original birth certificates for all adopted persons. Third, accountability for all, enacting incredibly strict federal licensing mandates to finally close those loopholes for attorneys and unlicensed agencies. And finally, shared responsibility, shifting the focus away from individual saviors and moving toward a collective commitment to truly caring for vulnerable families.
We want to leave you with this final, really striking question derived from today's sources. We've explored the business, the pipeline, the biopolitics, and the proposed solutions. But the ultimate takeaway from the text is this: can a society truly heal its systems and protect the vulnerable without first confronting its own deep psychological contradictions? Are we finally ready to let go of the comforting myths and face the complex reality of how we define and sometimes dismantle the family? Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer, and we strongly encourage you to keep questioning the systems around us.